good afternoon, or good day, depending on where you are on this globe and participating in this forum. Welcome to another edition of AFRAA SkyConnect Dialogues. Ladies and gentlemen, today we have a special guest and a special topic for discussion, a topic so crucial to our current and future survival as an industry that it becomes important for all of us to know what is happening, take an active role, and do our bit so that collectively Africa can be able to chart the path and move this industry to its rightful place. Ladies and gentlemen, as in previous sessions, we will have 1 hour for our meeting today. And my guest is no other than the environment expert from the African Civil Aviation Commission, Mr. Frankline Omondi. Shortly, I'll give Franklin the opportunity to tell us a bit about himself and a bit about AFCAC. Then we delve into our discussion today, which is going to be on the environmental sustainability and as it affects the businesses that we operate in the aviation sector. Ladies and gentlemen, we would explore Africa's collective response to the deteriorating environment that is impacting our activities as a region and affecting the entire world. We would then explore some of the measures that are being spearheaded by AFCAC and other organizations on the continent. We would look at the role of key policy decision makers on the continent and how this can all be fused together to enable Africa contribute its quota towards attaining the global net zero emission target by 2050. So ladies and gentlemen, sit back, relax, and participate in this discussion as we have always done. Note that we have our Q&A tab as well as the comment box. If you have a question or a comment, please use these channels and put your question or comments, and at the appropriate time, I would review them with our guests today so that we can give you the appropriate responses to your concerns. Otherwise, enjoy today's discussion and note that the environment is has reached a critical stage for not only aviation, but all business activities across the world, and that we all need to take an active role in playing our part. Our discussion today will see what is Africa doing, what can Africa further do, and where is Africa headed? Would we be able to attain these goals as set out by ICAO? Let us see. So ladies and gentlemen, without much ado, I want to welcome my guest, Mr. Frankline Omondi, to briefly tell us about himself and briefly also about his organization, the African Civil Aviation Commission, just in case some of our guests on today's show are not too familiar with the AFCAC. Mr. Franklin, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Raphael Kuchi. A big thank you to AFRAA for the kind invitation to AFCAC to take part in this SkyConnect Dialogue for this month of September. I'm really excited and honored to be here to speak and share some insights on the topic environmental protection and aviation sustainability. Just as a way of introduction, I'm Frankline Omondi. I know that there are friends and colleagues joining, but for the benefit of those who we've not interacted before, I work at the African Civil Aviation Commission as the environment expert. looking after issues to do with aviation, environmental protection, and sustainability, climate change policy, and efficiency at the Commission. I also have other roles that I play in coordination with the African states. I sit in ICAO Committee on Environmental Aviation Protection as the observer for AFCAC and coordinate with the African states in that technical committee. Before joining, I worked at an airline, the Kenya Airways, as an environment coordinator and fuel analyst. And I oversaw carbon emissions reduction, reporting, compliance, and risk mitigation. At AFCAC, AFCAC is a continental organization. It's an African Union specialized agency for civil aviation. We are responsible for the promotion and the sustainable development of aviation in Africa, working together with all the African states that are members of the African Union. AFCAC has got certain initiatives that drive the development of aviation in Africa, notably those that have been given to AFCAC by the parent organization of the African Union, such as the Single African Air Transport Market, which is intended to grow and increase intra-African travel. I think, Raphael, most of the details can also be found on the AFCAC website, but just as a way of introduction, I don't have the floor back to you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for that brief introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, so we've got an expert on the environment in aviation with us today. And so my first question to our guest would be, you know, Africa, when it comes to aviation, is really punching below its weight. A population of about 1.4 billion, and we're just doing under 200 million passengers a year, in fact, accounting for just about 2.1% of global traffic. So should we really be worried about our emission contribution to the global emission problem? Are we a part?
Indeed, Raphael, the statistics that you have presented on the contribution of Africa at the global stage in aviation is something that is, I would say, worrying for the African continent. I wonder if anyone has ever tried to travel from Cairo to Cape Town or Dakar to Nairobi just to have an experience and appreciate the extent and the size, the real size of Africa. Africa is a continent that is special and has got very many things that are interesting, or interesting factors. And if you compare the size of Africa and our contribution to the global aviation market share, you could argue that it is not necessary for us to really look at issues to do with or being concerned about our emissions. However, from an environmental or sustainability standpoint, I tend to think that we should. First of all, CO2 emissions is related to what I would say the larger picture of climate change. And climate change is an existential threat to humanity. And aviation plays its part because aircrafts burn fuel and release CO2 into the atmosphere. However, there is a ray of hope. Despite the statistics, Raphael, there are projections. Within ICAO and IATA projections, Africa is forecasted to grow at a rate of 3 to 5% from now until 2050. That is African aviation. The African Union and AFCAC have just concluded an aviation infrastructure gap analysis with a forecast of 25 years. And the results of this analysis indicate that using 2030 as the baseline year, passenger numbers in Africa are expected to triple by 2050, and traffic is expected to have doubled by 2050. So there is indications at ICAO level, by IATA and other sources, including the aviation infrastructure gap analysis that has been just concluded, that shows that Africa will grow. And this growth means if nothing is done, then the CO2 emission profile for Africa will also rise. However, there are initiatives in Africa that are looking at supporting that growth of African aviation, because aviation has got numerous benefits, but ensuring that the sustainability aspect, especially issues to do with the looking at maintaining or reducing CO2 emissions, are contained or reduced. Rafael?
So let me just interject here. I mean, yeah, so we should be worried about our future, our current and future emission growth, and try and do something about it today, is what I'm hearing you saying, because the potential for Africa to grow is enormous, and in no time our emission could equally grow higher. But if I were to look at it, you talked about sustainability, and African aviation definitely wants to be sustainable and responsible for whatever emissions it might be creating. Now, what do you mean when we say sustainable aviation growth as far as the environment is concerned? What should that entail?
Thank you, Rafael. Indeed, the word sustainability can be applied in a broad sense to various aspects. People do speak about financial sustainability. I would want to zero in on environmental sustainability. And I want to speak to the audience today about how aviation can grow and ensure that it grows in an environmentally sustainable way. Of course, we see that it is projected that Africa will grow. Africa is still considered as the last frontier, and there is a huge potential for aviation growth in Africa. There are existing initiatives, and I mentioned one of them is AFCAC being the executing agency of the Single African Air Transport Market, which is intended to unlock air travel in Africa so that aviation in Africa grows, increasing. In fact, today, AFCAC is pushing to increase what we call fifth freedom traffic in Africa from the current level of our analysis of 2% to 5% by the year 2030. The percentages may appear little, but the domino effect of this growth has got significant impacts on socioeconomic development of Africa. So the SATAM in itself is a driver of this growth. There are other initiatives at the African Union level under the AU Agenda 2063 flagship projects, initiatives such as the African Continental Free Trade Area, initiatives such as the free movement of persons, and others that are also going to support aviation growth. Having taken into consideration this projected growth and the initiatives that are being pushed in Africa for the aviation industry to grow, AFCAC has looked and considered that there is a need for sustainability and has come up with an initiative that is intended to support African states to accelerate efforts to develop, produce, and deploy sustainable aviation fuels. It is our belief that sustainable aviation fuels will support the growth because airlines need fuel to operate. Sustainable aviation fuels have technically been proven to have what in technical terms, a lower CO2 life cycle emission. And therefore, it will mean that it has got less damaging impacts on our global climate, Raphael.
Thanks for that. You touched on sustainable aviation fuel. I would come to that in a minute. But before we get there, just tell me, from a global perspective, what are some of the measures that has been outlined for the industry to work on towards attaining environmental sustainability?
Raphael, indeed, in environmental sustainability and environmental protection issues at a global stage have since 2018 been taking center stage in global discussions. At ICAO level, there are certain decisions and resolutions that have been taken to support the need for aviation to remain sustainable and address impacts on climate. Aviators would relate with the term COSIA, the Carbon Offsetting Reduction Scheme for International Aviation. Last assembly in 2022, the global aviation industry, that is all countries members of ICAO, adopted a long-term aspirational goal of net zero by 2050. So there is increasing focus on environmental sustainability in aviation. And all this, when you look at them, they are intended to address the continued emission of CO2 into the atmosphere. And some of the measures at the global level that are being put forth include issues to do with technological advancement. And this is looking at the way the aircraft of today are built, the type of propulsion and other aeronautical or dynamics that this aircraft flying today will have. And research today shows that if you compare the aircraft in operations today, or those that are being produced today, to those that were produced maybe 10, 20 years ago, the aircrafts of today are more efficient, quieter, and fuel efficient. So this is an example of a technological advancements in the way aircrafts are being constructed. The second measure is on looking at operations. And aviation is a very dynamic and very innovative industry, always finding ways to operate and operate better. So there has been a lot of efforts at the state level and also at airline level, and I would say the entire aviation industry, to optimize and improve efficiency. Efficiencies that are intended to ensure that we fly fast and principally safely, same distance, fly better and more efficient. And when we fly better and efficiently, it means that the airlines are flying the same distance probably with reduced amount of fuel compared to non-efficient operational approaches. And this efficient flying, I would say, is already showing advantages, an economic advantage to airlines, for example, because if you fly efficiently and you reduce the fuel that you don't ordinarily have burned, that means it saves you cost. But most importantly, it also has an impact on reducing the CO2 that is being emitted into the atmosphere. Thirdly, and this is a topic, a very hot topic, I know we'll touch on it again, is on the way the fuels of the aircraft are produced, or the way the fuels that are in use in the aircraft. And this is the issues to do currently with sustainable aviation fuels, or how aircraft engines will be fueled so that it continues to provide that service. And lastly, the fourth measure is on market-based measures. I've already mentioned at the ICAO assembly, there's a resolution that has been taken on COSIA. COSIA is basically airlines being asked to pay an amount to compensate for CO2 emissions that are as a result of their operations. Raphael.
So are the continental level, as African aviation stakeholders, are we doing our bit? Are we at par with other regions in terms of the steps that we are taking, whether be it CORSIA or the long-term sustainable goals or the SAP? Are our measures at par with what is happening elsewhere, or are we below, or are we ahead? How would you rate Africa?
I would say that Africa is playing its part, and increasingly Africa is giving recognition to the need for aviation in Africa to be environmentally sustainable. When I do a comparison, of course, different regions of the world are at different stages of economic development and even priorities in aviation. And therefore, Africa may, compared to other regions, may be ahead in some aspects and behind in some aspects. But the key message is, if you look at African aviation landscape from 2018 to date, Africa is playing its part. Africa, I would give an example. African states, most of them are currently exempted or are required to join the CORSIA scheme on a voluntary basis. Yet today, we have 25 African countries that have volunteered. In that aspect, Africa has played its part. And airlines that fly between those countries are subjected to the CORSIA offsetting requirements, for example. Africa has played its part in the discussions, in the development, and the process leading to the adoption of the long-term goal of net zero by 2050. And there has been, I've seen a lot of African experts taking part in these discussions and ensuring that the interest and the promotion, the need to promote aviation in Africa is taken into consideration at this global stage. So in that sense, again, Africa is playing its part. If you look at various African states today, there are many states that are always looking for ways to improve operations. I'm glad to say in this forum that AFRAA and AFCAC, through the free routing airspace initiatives, that is looking at ways in which African airlines can fly more efficient and thereby reduce the cost, reduce the fuel, and also address the challenges of CO2 emissions. So in that sense, Africa is playing its part. And of course, I've mentioned the infrastructure gap analysis that has just been concluded by the AUC and AFCAC. These are intended to improve efficiencies. These are intended to make aviation more efficient and cost-effective.
No, I'm happy to hear that on this front, Africa is really doing its bit to ensure that once more Africa is not left behind. Africa would want to move with the others so that at the end of the day, we become very sustainable and our industry can grow sustainably to support the economic activities on this continent. Now, let me shift a bit now to something you mentioned earlier on, the sustainable aviation fuels. You know, the IATA indicated that sustainable aviation fuels could contribute between 60 and 65% towards the attainment of the 2050 net zero emission targets. Therefore means sustainable aviation fuels is a very, very, very key component to the future of this industry going forward as far as the environment is concerned. The concerns, however, I've always had in Africa is that there's no enough production of sustainable aviation fuels. Where it is even available, we have challenges with infrastructure to move it to the airport, store it at the airports, and put it into planes for them to use. And the third element is that there's always a huge cost associated with sustainable aviation fuels. Now, are these the realities of the African market today with regards to SAF, or is something not happening right?
It is a global problem to start with. Indeed, technical work that has been done has shown that fuels or SAF, sustainable aviation fuels, has the greatest potential to reduce carbon dioxide emissions from international aviation. So in that sense, it is true that the potential to reduce CO2 emissions globally lies with developing and deploying these fuels. I would like to share some insights with the audience, Rafaela, and
yes,
technical work that has been done within ICAO level in Cape, where some of the African states have contributed immensely to this work. The integrated scenarios that were presented to the assembly that led to the adoption of the resolution on LTAC show that the global projected fuel demand by 2030 is about 330,000 kilotons of jet A1 or the conventional fuel. It is also projected that by 2030, looking at the current scenarios, only 16,000 tons of SAF will be produced, none in Africa by 2030. The global aviation industry has also taken, beyond the assembly resolution, the global aviation industry again met and came up with what they called a global framework for the deployment of SAF and other clean energy for aviation, placing a target of 5%, Rafael. 5% by 2030, we should have 5% replacing the current conventional fuel that we use. Please bear in mind that today in Africa, there are ongoing discussions and initiatives in Africa that intend to change that. And indeed, that must be changed. Africa must take action to reverse this trend. Because if the projections are anything to go by, and this is a technical analysis done by various experts from different regions of the world. So if nothing is done, we get to the year 2030, and globally, the world expects that we are supposed to have at least 5% of our fuel in use is SAF. We must take action today. What kind of actions then do we need to take? First of all, we need to address the issue of cost. The reason for the high high cost of SAF today, the SAF that is available, is largely related to the technologies and the research and development that has gone into the production of that SAF, the absence of infrastructure, and also just the unavailability of the fuel. So because the globe has not reached what I would say critical mass, or reached an economies of scale for SAF. The SAF that is available today, I would say airlines have already committed to take all of it. So this is a situation whereby there seems to be a higher demand than the supply. How do we then, as Africa, address these issues? And I want to say that AFCAC, working with the African states, has seen the need for ensuring that Africa refocuses and puts its efforts together to accelerate, take action, develop, produce, and deploy SAF. One of the key things that is required in Africa would be to look into the policy and regulatory landscape in Africa, especially that policy and regulatory landscape that addresses the issue of attracting the appropriate technology, promoting infrastructural development, and promoting the production of sustainable aviation fuels in Africa. So, Raphael, to sum up this issue, the reason and the challenges that we have for SAF today is the high cost and the unavailability of the SAF. And this needs to be addressed in the African context by all Africans by first looking at our regulatory landscape to overcome that barrier and set an enabling environment for technologies to be transferred, financing to be to attract financing and funds, and to ensure that it encourages the development, production, and deployment of SAF in Africa. Raphael?
That is very elaborate, and on this particular point, we need to develop the right regulatory framework, ensure that we are able to attract the financing, and be able to also take up the SAF that is produced on the continent. I have also been reading that Africa has enormous potential for SAF production, especially considering the vast land that Africa has that is currently not cultivated and can be used for SAF purposes, and also the fact that the feedstock that is needed for SAF production is readily available on the continent or can be easily produced on the available land that we have on the continent. Is this the situation? Is that what it is in Africa?
When we started this dialogue today, I mentioned that Africa is an interesting continent and has got various existing situations that make Africa unique and also positions Africa to play a key role in the global socioeconomic discussions. When we zero in on just looking at the issue of feedstock for SAF, various countries in Africa have done feasibility studies that clearly demonstrate that in terms of availability of this resource, Africa is blessed. Africa has got sufficient resources of feedstock that can lead to production of sustainable aviation fuels. So in that sense, it is true that Africa has got the resources. And Raphael, there has always been talk of the sustainability criteria of SAF, ensuring that in countries where food production has not reached a level whereby a country is food sufficient. The technologies that exist today indicate that SAF does not necessarily have to be produced from plant-based, for food-based plant materials. We have technologies that indicate that SAF can be produced from, you can name it, municipal waste, waste oil, plant residues that are not food crops. Therefore, and Africa has got enormous amounts of these resources. And therefore, the question of SAF potentially competing with food then is avoided by focusing on SAF production from these non-plant, non-food-based sources. And in that sense, again, I would say that Africa has the potential.
So you know, allow me to be a bit controversial here. Africa has this high potential in production of feedstock. And currently, we are not producing enough of SAF. And we need to get investments into that area. But paradoxically, while the whole world is looking at us moving towards more sustainable energy sources, increasingly on the African continent, I am hearing about new fossil fuel discoveries and huge investments going into doing offshore oil drilling in many parts of Africa. Now, considering that we're still having a lot of investment in this area, what can we do to actually shift the production base from fossil fuel to SAF so that we can have it in a more sustainable way? We can produce it at more competitive rates to support the industry's move in that direction.
Raphael, yes, and you've really touched on a very, I would say, controversial discussion. But I've earlier mentioned that the key to unlock renewable energy, basically renewable energy use in Africa, I believe, and more so on sustainable aviation fuels and the clean energy for aviation, lies on the policy landscape. It is true that in Africa there is a lot of work. I see a lot of work for example, in the African Union, focusing on looking at the energy security in Africa, and more so a strong focus on upscaling renewable energy sources to power Africa and move Africa to the next level under the Agenda 2063. Indeed, there are also new discoveries and a lot of investments into fossil fuel, and rightfully so, because countries have priorities, and they prioritize things that they believe would contribute to their economic development. I do believe that if we are able to get our policy framework or regulatory framework right, especially to support aviation, then we should be able to find a workable way to ensure that SAF become widely available. Raphael, I just want to touch on certain things about aviation. And there are things about the benefits of aviation. I mean, studies in 2018, for example, the Air Transport Action Group estimated that aviation in Africa supported 7.7 million direct and indirect jobs. And I would just want us to think about 7.7 million people employed in aviation. Aviation has got benefits that transcend countries and regions. The socioeconomic benefits of aviation, connecting people and regions, ensuring trade, supporting tourism, sustaining supply chains. Like during the COVID period, we saw aviation was key in ensuring that vaccines are delivered, movement of goods and services, the rapid movement of people over long distances in a safe, secure way. So aviation already has got very significant socioeconomic benefits. The world today is pushing for aviation to become sustainable and environmentally sustainable, for that matter. I do believe, and I would call upon African policymakers to prioritize aviation, first of all, and because of the benefits that aviation already displays, and more so prioritize sustainability in aviation. And Raphael, the aviation industry is projected to grow, and we support that growth. Indeed, that growth has to be supported, because as aviation grows, more jobs, more economic development for the continent. We just need to ensure that the policies that we put in place prioritizes aviation, ensures that we attract the necessary conditions that will support that growth. And one of them could be prioritization on research and development into sustainable aviation fuels, building of the required infrastructure, enhancing capacities, and strengthening of institutions, all of which are, Raphael, the objectives of the initiatives that we are trying to push in the continent.
Okay, great. Now, again, still on the sustainable production of SAF, they've always said in economics that you focus on the area where you have a competitive advantage and allow others to also focus on their competitive advantages so that you can export. That is the most efficient way of going about production. Now, in this regard, Africa seems to have a huge potential for feedstock production. And there's one school of thought which always saying Africa should focus on producing feedstock and allow those with the technology to convert this feedstock into fuels to do so, use the feedstock to produce fuel. But if we also look at it, Africa has historically been made the producer of raw materials. And I think probably this might be an occasion for us to start to begin to shift the balance a little bit. Now, the technology is not readily available on the continent, at least at the large scale level. At a small scale, there are various organizations and even in some cases, individuals who are producing some amount of stuff. But to scale it up, the technology is yet to be available here. Would you go with the school of thought that Africa keeps with the feedstock production, or those with the technology bring it closer to where the feedstock is? Because potentially also this is where the market growth lies. Let's produce a feedstock so we can feed the aviation industry on this side of the continent. What are your thoughts?
Raphael, Africa must enjoy the full economic benefits that come with SAF development, production, and deployment. And I repeat, Africa must enjoy that full economic benefit. The World Bank has conducted a study, and the study indicates that developing and producing SAF in Africa could potentially lead to 11 to 20 million additional jobs if Africa was to produce sustainable aviation fuels. It is a fact Africa is endowed with rich resources in terms of feedstocks. And it is also a fact that the missing gap is the technology being present in Africa to convert that feedstock into the fuel. It is also true that already there are existing expertise within the African continent. I would mention, for example, in South Africa, Nigeria have got capabilities of producing fuel. For example, in Nigeria, a report by Air Transport Group has shown that South Africa has got the potential in terms of the infrastructure may be limited, but indeed it exists in Africa. In Nigeria, there are what I would say very new refineries that could be repurposed for SAF production. So therefore, we just need to bridge the gap. And how do we bridge the gap? Aviation is an industry that I already said transcends borders and regions. I do believe that once we get our policy and regulatory framework right, collaboration amongst African countries will be very key. because you may find that one region in Africa has got rich resources in terms of feedstock, and another region may have existing technology. So it is important that there is a strong collaboration amongst African countries to leverage on the existing potentials, whether it is the existing potential be on feedstock production, existing potential on converting that feedstock. And already, I know that there is existing expertise, human resource with the know-how of using the technology to convert this field. So this already exists in Africa. My message and my take on this would be that for Africa to enjoy the full benefits of developing and producing and deploying this SAF, these issues must come together. And there are levers that must be moved. The lever on policy, collaboration, and lastly, on resources. And now I mean most on financial resources to attract investment so that we inject the investments in the right places. Already we've agreed, and it is demonstrated that there is economic benefit for SAF. We just need to inject the investment into the right places to make this a reality.
Okay. No, great stuff. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you are enjoying the discussion as I am. Please let your questions and comments come in. Before we proceed, Franklin, I have two questions here related to what we just discussed now. Both questions are from Aaron, and Aaron is saying, what is AFCAC doing to ensure that Africa is not forced on SAF as the only solution in which we can decarbonize? Why are we as Africa not pushing back on the imbalance of expecting us to be at the same level as those regions that have contributed to the pollution from time immemorial? I don't know whether that question is clear. Franklin?
Yes, I will make an effort, and probably Aaron could come and comment if I have done justice to the question. Yeah. I'll start by what is AFCAC doing? AFCAC is a continental body working with African states. And what we do it in collaboration and coordination with the African states at the global level. And the global level, I would liken it to ICAO assembly, where policies, standards on civil aviation are adopted or promulgated. At ICAO level, we ensure that we coordinate with the aviation industry stakeholders within African states. And one of the things that we have consistently done is whatever policies or standards that come, we interrogate it in terms of its impact on the growth and development of aviation in Africa, specifically on environment. I would say one of the key things that gives a buffer to the African continent from, I would say, quote unquote, being forced, is that we've ensured that, for example, the long-term goal on net zero by 2050 does not impose a responsibility to individual states. It is a collective global goal. And therefore states, African states or Africa, can contribute to that goal in a way that it sees or suits its aviation industry needs. The second thing that I would like to say, I see specifically on developing and deploying these sustainable aviation fuels as an opportunity for Africa. because of the obvious socio-economic benefits that countries that produce this fuel are going to derive from this, Rafael. I would like to stop at that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. If I may just follow through with the second question, which is interrelated. The second question is like, look, why are we rushing to sort of get into SAF production when, in fact, the age-old jet A1 fuel production we are not even able to do? Why don't we concentrate on producing jet A1 first and then consider SAF at a later stage? Do you agree?
Yeah, well, I would like to say again, I look at it as an opportunity. And of course, Africa cannot work in isolation. The current trend globally is to move away from Jet A1 towards more cleaner or sustainable sources of energy for aviation, and one of them is SAF. Focusing energy, and this would be my opinion, focusing our energy on producing Jet A1 today, while the rest of the world is already moving away from Jet A1. Engine manufacturers or OEMs are focusing on producing aircraft that will fly on SAF or hydrogen or even electric aircraft. In my opinion, as Africa, that sets us back, because tomorrow we will need to fly aircrafts that are electric or hydrogen powered or SAF powered. And therefore, it is the right time for Africa to focus its energy on renewable sources for aviation. And
okay, I get that. So we need to focus on actually leapfrogging to the next technology rather than allow ourselves to be held back by old technology that might soon fade away. And we've already committed so much investment to it. Well, now, time is fast running out on us. Let me go to the last segment of my discussion. And this is now actually on the roadmap to 2050. Because as you mentioned earlier on, there are the ICAO has come up with a clear roadmap for us to get to carbon neutral by 2050. And the industry is working on it. Now, in Africa, the basics, I'm not sure whether we are getting the basics right yet. That is monitoring, reporting, and verification of data. Do you have any knowledge on whether our stakeholders are getting this right? Are we on track?
Rafael, a lot is happening in Africa. Let me talk about data and the benefits of having data to drive action. In this sense, I believe that there is a potential and a room for improvement in Africa on how we collect and gather our data, especially on issues to do with SAF and other cleaner energy. I believe that there is a room for improvement. And what is Africa doing? At AFCAC, we have an initiative that is looking at setting up an infrastructure to gather and aggregate this data to inform policy decisions and also inform the way the continent or AFCAC outreaches to our stakeholders on aviation. So we are setting up a framework which is called APAD, aviation framework for data. This will help having this data and driving targeted policy when it comes to issues to do with environmental sustainability or even other domains of aviation. Today, data is held, and data is, whoever has data is king, because the whole world is looking for data, especially data on aviation. And this is what we've set out to do in AFCAC, so that it enables AFCAC to be more responsive and also have informed, to undertake its interventions in the continent in an informed way. Coming to monitoring, reporting, and verification. I would like to talk about COSIA, for example, which has come up with a standard in ICAO Annex 16, Volume 4, that places obligations to monitor, report, and verify to states and also airplane operators. This, to me, is a good framework that will enable, and it enables ICAO actually to have targeted interventions when it comes to these topics. And this is what we are trying to achieve within AFCAC by ensuring that we have a depository of data. And of course, we collaborate and partner with other people to make sure that the data we have is reliable, complete, and accurate in order for us to intervene. Rafael? Rafael, I think your microphone is muted. If you could unmute. Still unmuted from
Sorry about it. Sorry. Now, I was just saying that our time is limited. We just have about 3 minutes to go, but I cannot stop without asking you, you know, unlike countries which have borders, the environment is no respecter of borders. Therefore, global consensus action is what is very important. On the African continent, if individual countries are making progress and others are not making progress, collectively, we are not making progress. Now, so what is Africa doing at the policy decision level, at the continental level, at the regional, sub-regional level, to ensure that Africa move together as a holistic unit towards addressing our environmental challenges?
Rafael, in Africa, we have the advantage of having what we call regional economic communities and then continental level institutions. There exists, I think, 7 regional economic communities, which form the building blocks for continental integration. In the Western region, I think we have ECOWAS. In the Central region, we have the Economic Community for Central African States. In the North, we have the Maghreb, I think the Maghreb REC. We have SADC in the Southern region and EAC in East Africa. These are the building blocks for continental integration. And then overall, at the continental level, we have the mother, the African Union, and of course, with its specialized agencies such as AFCAC now looking after aviation. And this forms a very good framework for Africa to look at itself at a regional level and also how it harmonizes its issues at a continental level. Now, specifically on environmental sustainability, a lot of work is happening. I've mentioned that AFCAC has launched an initiative that is intended to ensure that African states should be able to produce sustainable aviation fuels at least by the year 2030, if we get it right in terms of the drivers that we are trying to push. At the regional level, there are other initiatives that are happening. Of course, first it starts at the individual state level and also at the regional level. I would give an example when we talk about aviation in, let me use an example of the southern region, the SADC. They have got an existing framework on how it promotes aviation in that region. And there is an existing framework on how SADC feeds into the general discussions within the continental level at the African Union level. And there is constant coordination and collaboration when it comes to aviation between AFCAC and the regional economic community. So some of these initiatives that we are driving are driven in collaboration with this regional economic community so that we ensure a level of harmonization of policies and approaches at the regional level and at the continental level. Raphael.
So are we looking at a bottom-up approach or a top-down approach? Because it is going from the REX now to the African Union. Is it also coming from the African Union down through the REX to the country level? Or it's from country, REX, AU? Not too sure. Which one are we going through?
Raphael, it is a mix of both. It's a mix of both in the sense that we also look at what is happening at a global level. So that could be an approach of top-down approach. Specific regions are also coming up with initiatives. That means it is bottom-up. The most important thing is to ensure that there is harmonization. The beauty about aviation is that we are highly regulated and standardized. So whatever initiatives we undertake, we ensure that it fits within the standards that have been agreed globally.
Okay, good. Thank you. Now, our time is up, but there are very critical questions that have just come in, and I would plead with you and with our audience, you can just touch base briefly on some of the questions. So the first one is from Seth Konedu. He says, education and training is an integral part of SAF production in Africa. How can AU and AFCAC provide policy direction to member states towards producing the graduates that harness the full potential of this sector?
Raphael, this is a very, it could form another dialogue altogether if
I know.
To do with education and capacitation of personnel, African personnel on civil, the general discussions on civil aviation. But briefly, AFCAC has come up with a framework working with the approved aviation training organizations to look at issues to do with capacitation of personnel. And one of the key pillars in our initiative to develop and deploy SAF in Africa is on strengthening institutions and enhancing technical capacities of people so that the people are able to undertake what is required of them to make the reality of net zero by 2050. But this is the framework that we are doing. There is a lot of collaboration we have with AATO, for example, looking at how to capacitate African personnel on all topics of in civil aviation domain.
Okay. Now, Nicholas Muli says, how is AFCAC balancing? Let me get the question again, just one moment. Just keep me. How is AFCAC balancing the growth of aviation in Africa and the need to reduce carbon emission and adhere to international environmental standards?
Very briefly, Raphael, two things. AFCAC is the executing agency of the YD and the SATAM. The SATAM is intended to increase intra-African travel, grow aviation in Africa. So in that sense, we are pushing to grow aviation in Africa. Number two, to balance out that, to make sure that the growth continues sustainably, we have come up with an initiative to work with African states to take efforts and action to develop and deploy sustainable aviation fuels. I talked about pushing the lever on policy landscape, pushing the lever on capacity building, pushing the lever on assessment, and also pushing the lever on advocacy to mobilize resources for that to happen.
Oh, thank you. Now, a follow-up question from Nicholas Mulimira says, how does AFCAC measure progress on environmental sustainability, and what key milestones do you foresee in the next 5 to 10 years?
Measuring progress on environmental sustainability, we have matrices, and some of them are matrices that have been developed at a global stage. The number of states taking part in the global schemes like COSIA is a measure that we could use. The number of states that have undertaken discussions, for example, to put in place policies that support fuel development and deployment is matrices. So we have matrices that we use to measure environmental sustainability. What milestones I see? I believe and I see Africa being able to turn the corner and produce its sustainable aviation fuels in the next 5 to 10 years.
Thank you. Good. Now, one more from Kwame Bekwai. Kwame says, setting up SAF facility often costs billions of dollars and require a consortium of members and companies, technology providers, bank, government, off-takers, and so on and so forth, keen to invest in such a facility in Africa. What can AFCAC do to connect the relevant stakeholders to create this bankable consortium to make such a project happen?
Raphael, we are doing a lot. We have embarked on a robust advocacy campaign, always talking about this initiative to accelerate and develop and produce SAF in Africa. One of them is on attracting resources of funds. That is one of the things that we are doing. We have existing partnerships at a continental level. We are closely working with the African Union and various financial institutions. And we do have events, workshops, and sessions whereby we discuss with these stakeholders mentioned here on what we need to do to make this a reality, Raphael. Currently, and it is my hope that towards the end of the year, there will be a very high-level forum whereby we will bring policymakers, technical people cutting across different government ministries, because the issue of aviation fuel does not only rest with aviation people. It also rests with people in the other ministries like energy and finance. And so we are working together with our parent organization, the African Union, to set up high-level dialogue whereby we will bring investors, policymakers into a room and point out to them the things that we consider as roadblocks and ask them to commit to removing those roadblocks, whether it is a roadblock in terms of making funds available. And so this is one of the things that we are doing so that we sensitize and we also encourage action to be taken.
Thank you. Thank you so much for those responses. In fact, Roland O'Hiri cannot agree with you more. He says, SAF is the way to go. Africa needs to figure out how to draw the focus of global investors who are now keenly searching on SAF to join forces with African stakeholders for SAF development on the continent. And I thank you very much for this. But before I let you go, as I always do for all my guests, my audience are waiting to get a final word from you. And if somebody has not taken anything from this whole discussion at all, at least give them one reason to be excited about SAF and the environment going into the future. You have the floor.
Raphael, thank you. My final thoughts. I would start by saying aviation is an industry with immense socio-economic benefits. Secondly, I would call us all to action. I would start with policymakers or governments that there is a strong need to prioritize aviation in order for the continent to reap from the full benefits that aviation offers. Secondly, I see a lot of work done and projections showing that African aviation will grow. Therefore, this growth must not be stopped. It must not be curtailed. It must be allowed to take its natural course. I also believe that we must support this growth by looking at environmental sustainability, especially those environmental sustainability aspects that address climate change, which I already mentioned is an existential threat to humanity. Thirdly,
yeah, go ahead.
I would like to say that collaboration and partnerships amongst African states and institutions in Africa will be the only way that we can collectively take action and move the levers that need to be moved to be able to make Africa realize the potential it has of producing the reality of producing SAF and deploying it for use by airlines in Africa. Thank you, Raphael.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. And this is where we draw the curtains to another session of AFRAA SkyConnect. And thank you very much, my guest, Mr. Frankline Omondi, the environment expert at the African Civil Aviation Commission, AFCAC. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your time and for your patience. To those who have contributed questions and comments to this discussion, we appreciate all of you and we thank you for your contribution. There are a few questions and comments that came in a bit last minute and I could not take them. Very sorry about that. We hope we'll have time next time to be able to delve into all comments and questions. Until we meet again next month, thank you very much for your time and do have a nice week and a day ahead. Bye-bye for now. Bye.